The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Ashworth Palace as Princess Eleanor Victoria stood at the grand window of her private chambers. Her fingers traced the cold glass while she watched the royal gardens below, where gardeners moved like silent figures tending to the autumn roses. Today felt different from all the others, though she couldn't quite understand why. The weight of her royal duties had always been heavy, but lately it seemed unbearable. Eleanor had spent her entire 28 years preparing for this moment. The coronation was only 3 months away, and soon she would become Queen of Valdoria, a small but prosperous European kingdom nestled between the mountains and the sea. Her father, King Alexander, had ruled with wisdom and grace for 40 years, but his recent illness had forced him to step back from many responsibilities. The burden now fell on Eleanor's shoulders, and she felt the crushing weight of an entire nation's expectations. The princess moved away from the window and walked to her mahogany desk, where hundreds of letters from citizens across the kingdom waited for her attention. Each letter told a story of struggle, hope, or gratitude. Some came from farmers facing difficult harvests, others from families celebrating new births, and many from young people seeking guidance about their futures. Eleanor read every single one, believing that understanding her people's lives was essential to being a good ruler. Her lady-in-waiting, Margaret, entered the room carrying a silver tray with morning tea and fresh pastries from the palace kitchen. Margaret had served the royal family for over 2 decades and had become more like a trusted friend than a servant to Eleanor. She noticed the princess's troubled expression immediately. "Your Highness, you've been standing at that window for nearly an hour," Margaret said gently, setting the tray on a small table near the fireplace. "The royal council is expecting you in the throne room at 10 o'clock for the budget meeting." Eleanor sighed deeply and walked over to accept the warm cup of tea. The familiar ritual of morning tea usually brought her comfort, but today even this simple pleasure felt hollow. "Margaret, do you ever wonder if we're truly making a difference? All these meetings, ceremonies, and decisions. Are we actually helping our people live better lives?" Margaret studied the princess's face carefully. She had watched Eleanor grow from a curious child into a compassionate young woman who genuinely cared about her future subjects. "Your Highness, I've seen the way people's faces light up when you visit their towns. I've watched children run to greet you, and I've seen elderly citizens cry with joy when you remember their names from previous visits. You have a gift for connecting with people that your father greatly admires." The princess nodded, but doubt still clouded her eyes. She had always felt the gap between her privileged life in the palace and the real struggles of ordinary citizens. Despite her education, travels, and preparation, she sometimes felt like she was living in a beautiful prison, separated from the world she was meant to serve. As Eleanor prepared for her day, she thought about her childhood friend Thomas, who had grown up in the village near the palace. They had played together as children when his father worked as the head groundskeeper. Thomas had always dreamed of traveling the world, writing stories and experiencing life beyond the kingdom's borders. Last month he had sent her a letter from Paris where he was working as a journalist. His descriptions of city life, of meeting people from different cultures, and of having the freedom to go wherever his curiosity led him, made Eleanor feel envious. The sound of church bells from the village reminded Eleanor that she had duties waiting. She straightened her shoulders, adjusted her royal blue dress, and prepared to face another day of endless meetings and responsibilities. But deep in her heart, a small voice whispered questions about whether this was truly the life she wanted, or simply the life that had been chosen for her before she was even born. As she walked through the palace corridors toward the throne room, Eleanor passed portraits of her ancestors, kings and queens who had ruled Valdoria for over 4 centuries. Their painted eyes seemed to watch her, reminding her of the weight of tradition and expectation that rested on her shoulders. She wondered if any of them had ever felt the same doubts, the same longing for something different, the same fear that they might not be enough for the role they had inherited. The Royal Council meeting stretched on for what felt like hours as ministers presented budget reports and policy proposals. Eleanor sat in the ornate throne that would soon permanently be hers, trying to focus on discussions about infrastructure improvements and trade agreements. Her mind, however, kept wandering to the letter she had received that morning from her university friend Sarah, who was now working as a doctor in refugee camps across Africa. Sarah's letter described the incredible challenges and rewards of her work, helping families who had lost everything, but still managed to find hope. She wrote about sleeping under the stars, learning new languages from the people she served, and feeling like every day brought meaningful purpose. The contrast between Sarah's adventures and Eleanor's scheduled life of ceremony and protocol felt stark and painful. "Princess Eleanor, what are your thoughts on the proposed education reform?" asked Lord Chancellor Harrison, pulling her attention back to the meeting. His gray eyebrows were raised expectantly, and the entire council was looking at her for guidance. Eleanor quickly gathered her thoughts, drawing on the research she had done the previous week. "I believe we should prioritize funding for rural schools and technology access. Our kingdom's future depends on ensuring every child has equal opportunities for learning, regardless of where they live." The council members nodded approvingly and continued their discussions. Eleanor participated actively in the meeting, but part of her mind remained elsewhere. She thought about the young woman she had met during her last official visit to the northern province, a brilliant student who dreamed of becoming an engineer, but whose family couldn't afford to send her to university. Eleanor had quietly arranged a scholarship for the girl, but she wondered how many other talented young people were slipping through the cracks. After the meeting ended, Eleanor walked through the palace gardens seeking solace among the autumn flowers. The royal gardens were magnificent with carefully planned pathways, elegant fountains, and flowers from around the world. Yet today they felt like another beautiful cage. She found herself at the small gate that led to the village path, a route she had taken countless times as a child but rarely used now due to security protocols. Standing at the gate, Eleanor noticed a young boy sitting on a stone wall just outside the palace grounds. He was reading a worn book and looked completely absorbed in its pages. Something about his concentration reminded her of herself as a child, when she would hide in the palace library for hours, reading about distant lands and exciting adventures. "Excuse me?" Eleanor called softly through the gate. The boy looked up, his eyes widening as he recognized her. "What are you reading?" The boy, who appeared to be about 12 years old, held up his book shyly. "It's about explorers, Your Highness. This chapter is about a woman who climbed the highest mountains in every continent." Eleanor smiled genuinely for the first time that day. "That sounds fascinating. Do you dream of being an explorer yourself?" "Oh yes, Your Highness." The boy's face lit up with excitement. "I want to see the whole world and write about all the amazing places and people I meet. My teacher says I'm good at writing stories." The simple enthusiasm in the boy's voice touched something deep in Eleanor's heart. Here was someone with unlimited dreams and possibilities ahead of him, while she felt trapped by the circumstances of her birth. She found herself envying this young stranger's freedom to imagine any future he wanted. "Never stop dreaming," she told him warmly. "The world needs explorers and storytellers." As Eleanor walked back toward the palace, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking away from something important. The boy's excitement about his future possibilities highlighted her own sense of being locked into a predetermined path. She had everything anyone could want: wealth, status, education, and the respect of millions. Yet she felt empty inside. That evening, Eleanor sat in her private study, surrounded by official documents and correspondence. On her desk lay 3 items that represented the conflict in her heart: the crown that would soon be placed on her head, Sarah's letter describing her meaningful work helping others, and a travel magazine featuring stories about people who had given up conventional lives to pursue their passions. She picked up her phone and stared at Thomas's contact information. They had been messaging occasionally since childhood, but their lives had taken such different directions that their conversations had become more formal and less frequent. Tonight she felt an overwhelming urge to talk to someone who had known her before she became consumed by royal duties. Eleanor began typing a message, then deleted it, then started again. How could she explain to someone that having everything felt like having nothing? How could she admit that she sometimes wondered what it would be like to walk away from the only life she had ever known? The weight of these thoughts kept her awake long into the night, staring at the ceiling of her gilded bedroom and wondering if courage meant accepting your destiny or having the strength to choose a different path. 3 weeks later, Eleanor found herself facing the most difficult decision of her life. The catalyst came in the form of an unexpected phone call from her university professor, Dr. Elizabeth Moore, who had become a mentor and friend during Eleanor's brief time studying international relations before her royal duties took precedence. "Eleanor, I have an extraordinary opportunity that I wanted to discuss with you. Dr. Moore said during their conversation. The United Nations is launching a new humanitarian program focusing on education and women's rights in developing countries. They need someone with your background, languages, and diplomatic skills to lead a team working directly with communities in South America and Southeast Asia. The position would require at least 2 years of fieldwork. Eleanor's heart raced as she listened to the details. This was exactly the kind of meaningful work she had dreamed about. The chance to make a real difference in people's lives, rather than simply attending ceremonial functions and signing documents. But the timing couldn't have been worse. Her coronation was now only 6 weeks away. Dr. Moore, you know I can't possibly accept something like this, Eleanor said, though her voice lacked conviction. I have responsibilities here that I cannot abandon. I understand the complexity of your situation, her professor replied gently. But I also remember the passionate young woman who wrote her thesis on grassroots community development. You argued brilliantly that real change comes from working alongside people, not governing from a distance. This position would allow you to put those beliefs into practice. After the call ended, Eleanor sat in stunned silence. The opportunity felt like the universe offering her a chance to live the life she had always secretly wanted. But accepting it would mean abandoning her kingdom, her family, and centuries of tradition. The weight of disappointing millions of people who were counting on her felt overwhelming. That evening, King Alexander summoned Eleanor to his private study. Her father looked frailer than usual, the recent months of illness having taken their toll. Despite his weakened appearance, his eyes still held the sharp intelligence that had made him a respected leader for 4 decades. My dear daughter, I can see that something is troubling you deeply, he said, gesturing for her to sit in the comfortable chair beside his desk. You've been distant and preoccupied lately. As your father and your king, I'm concerned. Eleanor struggled with how much to reveal. She had always been honest with her father, but this situation felt too complicated and potentially hurtful to discuss openly. Father, do you ever regret the path your life took? Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you had been born into a different family? King Alexander studied his daughter's face carefully. He had suspected for some time that Eleanor was struggling with her upcoming responsibilities, but this was the first time she had voiced her doubts so directly. Eleanor, I became king when I was 25, younger than you are now. I remember feeling terrified and unprepared. I questioned whether I could live up to the expectations of our people. But did you ever want to run away? Eleanor asked quietly. Did you ever dream of having a completely different life? Her father was silent for several long moments. There were times, especially in the early years, when I envied friends who could travel freely, choose their own careers, and make decisions based purely on their personal desires. But over time, I discovered that serving others, even when it required personal sacrifice, brought a different kind of fulfillment than pursuing individual dreams. Eleanor nodded, but his words didn't ease the conflict in her heart. What if someone could serve others more effectively by choosing a different path? What if traditional royal duties aren't the best way to make a positive impact? King Alexander's expression grew more serious. Eleanor, are you trying to tell me something specific? If you're having doubts about the coronation, we need to discuss this honestly. The direct question hung in the air between them. Eleanor felt tears forming in her eyes as she realized she was at a crossroads that would determine the rest of her life. She could continue down the expected path, become queen, and spend her life in the comfortable but restrictive world of royal protocol. Or she could take the leap into uncertainty, following her heart toward a life of purpose that she had only dreamed about. Father, what if I told you that I had an opportunity to serve people in a different way? What if I could help communities around the world, work directly with families in need, and use my education and skills in ways that might have more immediate impact than ceremonial royal duties?
King Alexander leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable.
Eleanor, you're talking about abandoning your birthright, your people, and your family's legacy. The consequences of such a decision would be enormous, not just for you, but for our entire kingdom. I know, Eleanor whispered, her voice breaking slightly, but I also know that I'm dying inside thinking about spending the rest of my life in meetings and ceremonies, while knowing I could be out there actually helping people who desperately need assistance. The conversation continued late into the night, with father and daughter wrestling with questions that had no easy answers. As Eleanor finally returned to her chambers, she knew that she had to make a choice soon. The weight of tradition and expectation pulled her in one direction, while her heart and conscience pulled her toward an uncertain but potentially meaningful future. The young woman who had once dreamed of adventure now faced the reality that sometimes the greatest adventure requires the courage to disappoint the people you love most. The next morning brought unexpected clarity when Eleanor received devastating news that changed everything. Margaret rushed into her chambers at dawn, her face pale and hands trembling as she delivered a message that had just arrived from the northern provinces. Your Highness, there's been a terrible earthquake in the mountain region. Several villages have been completely destroyed and hundreds of families are homeless. The rescue teams are overwhelmed, and they're asking for immediate royal assistance to coordinate international aid. Eleanor felt her heart sink as she read the detailed reports. The earthquake had struck the poorest region of Valdoria, where many families were already struggling with economic hardship. Images of collapsed homes, injured children, and displaced families filled her mind. This was exactly the kind of crisis where she could make a real difference. But the traditional royal response would be to make a ceremonial visit, offer condolences, and delegate the actual rescue work to others. Margaret, prepare the emergency council meeting immediately, Eleanor said, her voice filled with determination, and cancel all my appointments for the next week. I'm going to the disaster zone personally to help coordinate relief efforts. Margaret looked surprised. Your Highness, the security team will never approve a direct visit to such a dangerous area. The aftershocks are still continuing and the situation is too unstable for a royal presence. But Eleanor had already made up her mind. This crisis had crystallized her thoughts about what kind of leader she wanted to be. She could either follow protocol and remain safely in the palace while others did the actual work of helping people, or she could take action based on her values and training. Within hours, Eleanor had assembled a small team of advisors and security personnel for an emergency trip to the affected region. Against the strong objections of the Royal Council, she insisted on traveling with medical supplies, emergency communications equipment, and a hands-on approach to disaster relief that was unprecedented for Valdoria's royal family. The helicopter ride to the mountains showed Eleanor the full scope of the devastation. Entire villages had been reduced to rubble, roads were impassable, and rescue workers were struggling to reach isolated communities. As they landed at the temporary command center, Eleanor felt more focused and energized than she had in months. For the next 5 days, Eleanor worked alongside rescue teams, medical personnel, and volunteers from around the kingdom. She helped distribute food and water, assisted in setting up temporary shelters, and used her language skills to communicate with international aid organizations. Most importantly, she spent time with survivors, listening to their stories, holding crying children, and offering comfort to elderly residents who had lost everything. On the 3rd day, Eleanor met Maria Santos, a young mother whose house had collapsed while she was at work, trapping her 6-year-old daughter Sophia inside. Maria had been frantically digging through the rubble with her bare hands when rescue workers arrived. Sophia was found alive but injured, and both mother and daughter were now staying in the emergency shelter. Princess Eleanor, Maria said when they met, tears streaming down her face. I don't know how to thank you for being here. When I saw you helping to carry supplies and talking to the children, it gave me hope that Sophia and I will somehow rebuild our lives. Eleanor knelt beside Sophia's cot in the medical tent, where the little girl was recovering from a broken arm and several cuts. Despite her injuries, Sophia smiled when she saw Eleanor, and shyly offered to share her coloring book. What do you want to be when you grow up? Eleanor asked softly. I want to help people like you're doing, Sophia replied without hesitation. I want to make scared children feel better. That simple conversation with a brave 6-year-old changed Eleanor's perspective completely. Here was a child who had just survived a terrifying experience, yet her first instinct was to think about helping others. Eleanor realized that true leadership wasn't about wearing a crown or living in a palace, and it was about being present when people needed you most and using whatever resources you had to make their lives better. On her final evening in the disaster zone, Eleanor sat outside the command tent, looking up at the stars that seemed brighter in the mountain air. Her phone buzzed with a message from Dr. Moore, asking if she had made a decision about the United Nations position. The deadline for accepting the offer was only 2 days away. Eleanor thought about everything she had experienced during the past week. She had seen the immediate impact of hands-on humanitarian work, felt the satisfaction of directly helping people in crisis, and discovered leadership skills she never knew she possessed. She had also realized that her royal position, with its resources and influence, could be a powerful tool for organizing help and bringing attention to important causes. As she prepared to return to the palace, Eleanor knew that she faced a choice that would define not just her own future, but the future of Valdoria's monarchy. She could accept the UN position and pursue the meaningful work she had always dreamed about, or she could find a way to transform the role of queen into something that combined traditional duties with active humanitarian service. The earthquake had shown her that she didn't have to choose between serving her people and following her passion for helping others. Perhaps there was a third option that she hadn't considered before, becoming a different kind of queen, one who led by example and used her position to create positive change, both within Valdoria and around the world. The question now was whether she had the courage to redefine what royal service could look like in the modern world. Eleanor returned to the palace with a radical proposal that would shake the foundations of Valdoria's monarchy. She had spent the entire helicopter ride back, drafting a detailed plan that would allow her to accept the crown while completely revolutionizing what it meant to be queen in the 21st century. Her father was waiting in the throne room when she arrived, along with the full royal council. King Alexander looked relieved to see his daughter safe, but his expression grew concerned as he noticed the determined look in her eyes. "Father, honorable council members," Eleanor began, standing before them still wearing the practical clothes she had worn during the disaster relief work. "I need to share with you what I've learned during the past week, and present a proposal for the future of our monarchy." She spent the next hour describing her experiences in the earthquake zone, the people she had met, and the impact that direct humanitarian work could have. The council members listened with growing alarm as they realized where her thoughts were leading. "Your Highness," interrupted Lord Chancellor Harrison, "surely you're not suggesting that a queen should personally involve herself in dangerous rescue operations? The monarchy's role is to provide stability and ceremonial leadership, not to engage in field work that could be handled by trained professionals." Eleanor had anticipated this response. "Lord Chancellor, I'm suggesting that our monarchy has become disconnected from the real needs of our people and the world around us. While we hold elaborate ceremonies and attend formal dinners, millions of people are suffering from poverty, natural disasters, and injustice. We have the resources, education, and influence to make a real difference, but we're not using these gifts effectively." She presented her detailed proposal. Valdoria would establish a new model of humanitarian monarchy, where the royal family would maintain traditional ceremonial duties while also leading international humanitarian efforts. Eleanor would spend 6 months each year working with organizations like the United Nations, directly serving communities in need around the world. The remaining 6 months would be devoted to domestic royal duties and using her international experiences to improve policies within Valdoria. "This is unprecedented and potentially dangerous," said Minister of Defense General Martinez. "A queen cannot simply disappear into conflict zones and disaster areas. The security risks alone make this proposal impossible." But Eleanor had thought through every objection. "General, with proper planning and security measures, we can minimize risks while maximizing impact. More importantly, we need to ask ourselves what kind of legacy we want to leave. Do we want to be remembered as rulers who stayed safely in palaces while the world suffered, or as leaders who used their privileges to serve others?" King Alexander had remained silent throughout the presentation, but now he spoke quietly. "Eleanor, what you're proposing would fundamentally change the nature of our monarchy. The consequences could be enormous. Some people will see this as abandoning tradition and royal dignity." "Father, I believe some traditions need to change if they're no longer serving their purpose," Eleanor replied. "The earthquake showed me that people don't need a queen who waves from balconies. They need a leader who will work alongside them when they're facing their darkest moments." The debate continued for hours, with council members raising concerns about everything from security to constitutional law. Eleanor answered each objection with careful research and passionate conviction. She had consulted with legal experts, security professionals, and international organizations to ensure that her proposal was feasible. Late that evening, After the council had dismissed for the night, Eleanor sat alone with her father in his study. King Alexander looked exhausted by the day's discussions, but his eyes showed a mixture of pride and worry. "Eleanor, I've never seen you more determined or articulate than you were today," he said. "But I need you to understand the magnitude of what you're proposing. If you pursue this path, you'll face criticism from traditionalists, skepticism from world leaders, and constant danger from the humanitarian work itself." Eleanor nodded solemnly. "I understand the risks, Father, but I also understand that I can't live with myself if I accept the crown only to spend my life attending garden parties, while knowing I could be saving lives instead. There's something else you need to consider," King Alexander continued. "If you become this kind of queen, you'll be setting a precedent that will affect the monarchy for generations. Your children, if you have them, will inherit these expectations. You'll be creating a new kind of royal burden." This thought had occurred to Eleanor during her planning. Perhaps that's exactly what the world needs. A new kind of royal burden. Instead of the burden of ceremony and privilege, maybe future monarchs should carry the burden of service and sacrifice. King Alexander smiled for the first time that day. "You sound exactly like your mother when she was your age. She also wanted to change the world, though she never imagined doing it quite this way." Eleanor felt tears forming in her eyes. Her mother, Queen Isabella, had died in a car accident when Eleanor was 15. She had been beloved by the people for her compassion and her work with children's charities, but she had never had the opportunity to pursue the kind of direct humanitarian work that Eleanor was now proposing. "Father, I think Mother would understand what I'm trying to do," Eleanor said softly. "She always taught me that privilege comes with responsibility, and that we should use our advantages to help those who have fewer opportunities." As the night wore on, father and daughter talked about the future of their kingdom, their family, and their legacy. King Alexander finally admitted that while Eleanor's proposal terrified him, it also filled him with pride. His daughter had developed into a leader with vision, courage, and genuine compassion for others. "Eleanor, if this is truly what you believe is right, then I will support you," he said finally. "But you must promise me that you'll be careful, that you'll take every possible precaution, and that you'll never forget that Valdoria needs you too." Eleanor embraced her father, feeling both the weight of his support and the enormous responsibility she was accepting. Tomorrow she would announce her decision to the world, knowing that she was about to embark on a journey that would either transform the monarchy into something beautiful and meaningful, or destroy it completely. The coronation of Queen Eleanor Victoria took place on a crisp October morning, but it was unlike any royal ceremony in Valdoria's history. Instead of the traditional elaborate gown, Eleanor wore a simple but elegant dress made by local artisans from sustainable materials. Representatives from humanitarian organizations around the world sat alongside traditional dignitaries, and children from the earthquake-affected villages held places of honor in the cathedral. Eleanor's coronation speech stunned the international community. Standing before the ancient crown, she spoke not about the glory of monarchy, but about the responsibility to serve those who needed help most. She announced the establishment of the Valdoria Humanitarian Initiative, which would coordinate disaster relief, education programs, and community development projects around the world. "Today, I accept this crown not as a symbol of power over others, but as a commitment to use whatever influence I have in service of those who are suffering," Eleanor declared to the packed cathedral and millions watching around the world. A true leader does not rule from a distance, but works alongside their people to build a better future for everyone. The reaction was immediate and intense. Traditional monarchists criticized Eleanor for diminishing the dignity of royal office, while humanitarian groups praised her vision and courage. International media couldn't decide whether to label her a revolutionary reformer or a naive idealist, but Eleanor remained focused on her mission, undeterred by the controversy surrounding her unconventional approach to royal duties. Within 6 months of her coronation, Queen Eleanor had already made 3 major humanitarian trips. She spent 2 weeks in Bangladesh helping with flood relief, worked with education programs in rural Guatemala, and assisted with refugee resettlement efforts in Jordan. Each trip was carefully planned with extensive security measures, but Eleanor insisted on doing real work rather than merely making ceremonial appearances. During her time in Bangladesh, Eleanor lived in the same temporary shelters as relief workers, helped distribute clean water to affected communities, and worked with local women to establish sustainable farming programs. Photographs of the Queen carrying supplies through flooded villages and teaching children in makeshift schools went viral on social media, inspiring young people around the world to get involved in humanitarian work. The most challenging moment came during her visit to Jordan, where Eleanor met Amira, a 17-year-old Syrian refugee who had fled her homeland with her younger siblings after their parents were killed in the conflict. Amira was brilliant and determined to become a doctor, but had no resources to continue her education. "Your Majesty," Amira said during their meeting at the refugee camp, "seeing you here gives me hope that someone with power actually cares about people like us. But I worry that after you leave, nothing will really change." Eleanor was moved by Amira's honesty and determination. She spent hours talking with refugees about their experiences, their hopes, and their practical needs. This visit led to Eleanor establishing a scholarship program that would provide university education opportunities for refugee students, with Amira becoming one of the first recipients. Back in Valdoria, Eleanor's unconventional reign was transforming the kingdom's culture. Young people were inspired to pursue careers in international development, environmental protection, and social justice. The royal palace was converted into a training center for humanitarian workers, and traditional royal events were replaced with conferences addressing global challenges. Not everyone approved of the changes. Eleanor faced criticism from some citizens who missed the glamour and ceremony of traditional monarchy. Several noble families expressed concern that the Queen's dangerous humanitarian work would eventually lead to tragedy. The international royal community was divided, with some monarchs privately questioning whether Eleanor's approach was appropriate for a head of state. But the support Eleanor received from unexpected sources gave her strength to continue. Letters poured in from ordinary people around the world who were inspired by her example. Sophia, the little girl Eleanor had met during the earthquake, sent her a drawing of them working together with the words, "Thank you for showing me how to help people," written in crayon at the bottom. Thomas, Eleanor's childhood friend, wrote to her from his journalism assignment in Southeast Asia, "Eleanor, you've become the leader I always knew you could be. You're proving that real change comes from people who are willing to get their hands dirty and work for something bigger than themselves." A year after her coronation, Queen Eleanor stood once again in the palace gardens where she had once felt trapped, but now instead of seeing the gardens as a beautiful prison, she saw them as a peaceful refuge between missions. Tomorrow she would leave for her next humanitarian assignment in East Africa, where drought had created a crisis for millions of people. Margaret approached with the day's correspondence, including updates from all the projects Eleanor had initiated around the world. The flood victims in Bangladesh were successfully rebuilding their communities with improved infrastructure. Amira had completed her first year of medical school with excellent grades and was volunteering at clinics during her breaks. The scholarship program had expanded to help over 1,000 refugee students pursue higher education. "Your Majesty," Margaret said with a smile, "you have a video call scheduled with the UN Secretary General about the new climate adaptation program, and the Minister of Education wants to discuss expanding the international exchange program for Valdorian students." Eleanor nodded, feeling energized rather than overwhelmed by her responsibilities. She had learned that meaningful work, even when it was difficult and sometimes dangerous, brought a satisfaction that no amount of ceremony or luxury could provide. She had also discovered that leadership meant creating opportunities for others to make a difference, not just making a difference yourself. As the sun set over the palace grounds, Eleanor reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had given up the comfortable, predictable life of a traditional queen, but in return she had gained something far more valuable, the knowledge that her life had purpose and that her work was making the world a little bit better for people who needed help. The crown she wore now felt lighter than it had on her coronation day, not because the responsibility was less, but because she had learned to carry it with joy rather than burden. Queen Eleanor had proven that sometimes the greatest act of loyalty to your people is having the courage to serve them in a completely new way.